Hi friends, we are here to do this week's Bible study. This week's text is John 6 verses 1 through 13. It's the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. And so let us begin. At the beginning of John 6, it says, after this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. So he had been doing ministry in the area of Capernaum, which we talked about a few weeks ago being kind of Jesus's home base. And so that's in the northern part of the Jewish world. And they're going to be traveling across the Sea of Galilee, and on the other side of that is the town of Bethsaida. And so they're in the plain area outside of Bethsaida. Here we go. So after this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs he was doing for their sick. Jesus went up to the mountain and sat there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people? Jesus said, Make the people sit down. Now there was a great deal of grass in that place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. Okay. So we're going to think a little bit about this text and what it is trying to communicate to us about. We've looked at this text from the perspective of what is it encouraging the disciples to do? How is Jesus, providing? What does it tell us about faith? All of that kind of stuff. Today we're going to be looking at it from kind of a neighboring perspective. And so what does it tell us about neighboring? And just those little shifts of perspective sometimes change what stands out to us within a text. And so let's see. Okay, so after this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. So again, it's just letting us know that he's getting into a boat and traveling from the Capernaum side of the Sea of Galilee to the Bethsaida side. That's about a 4-mile distance across that they would have sailed. And it says a large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was doing for the sick. And so that means that they stayed on foot. They didn't travel across the water. They went up and around the northern portion of it, which according to commentaries is about a 9-mile trek. And so they see Jesus headed to the other side. In other gospels, the accounts of this story, it talks about how Jesus needed, after he had been healing the sick, he needed some time alone. So he went into the boat to have some time, to get to the other side so he could have some time apart. And when he got there, everybody was already there. In this one, we have kind of Jesus arriving and then the crowds arriving after him. But regardless, Jesus isn't getting any of that downtime. He's being followed by a group of people who are committed to seeing him. And it says in this case, it's because they saw the signs he had been doing for their sick. And this signs is anything that is significantly noted. Jesus went up the mountain and sat there with his disciples. Now, how the commentaries describe this area is that there's a big hill, and Jesus would be sitting on the hill, and kind of the people are below him in a bowl of grassy area. And so Jesus went up and sat down there with his disciples. In Luke's gospel, it talks about how he continues to have compassion on them and heal their sick. We don't get that piece here. We just get Jesus hanging out on the mountain and then deciding he wants to feed them. So now the Passover, the festival of the Jews was near. Likely this little note was intended to just let us know that there is a lot of people traveling, and the festival of Passover would draw Jews from, I think if you were 20 miles away, you had to go towards Jerusalem. So that would be there within the 20-mile radius. And then beyond that, it was encouraged that you went within your lifetime. And so people would be traveling from all over the place on these roads, and likely interacting with, so that meant that as these crowds are coming towards Jesus, more and more people are joining them. So it's to explain why there would be such a large crowd traveling. And so when he looked up and he saw the large crowd coming towards him, Jesus says to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" And so in this account of the feeding of the 5,000, it's early on. As soon as he sees the crowds, he's like, we're going to need to feed these people. And he turns to Philip. Why Philip? Well, in this case, Philip, we know from the beginning of John, is from Bethsaida, which is the side of the Sea of Galilee that they're on right now. And so it would absolutely make sense for him to ask Philip, because Philip would be familiar with this area. Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat? And now it says, he said this to test him, for Jesus himself knew what he was going to do. And so that's interesting. Like, what does that mean? Like, what did he hope for Philip to say? What Philip does say is that 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. There are so many people that this amount of money, which is equivalent to about 6 months of a normal person's wages, wouldn't feed them. So he's saying it's impossible for us to do this. It doesn't matter what I know about this area. There is no way we're going to be able to get all of these people fed. And so we get to wonder a little bit, or imagine, if Jesus was asking this to test him, what would have gotten him an A? What was a good response from Jesus? Maybe Philip just saying, you tell us. We know that you're good for this. We know that you can feed them if you want to, so you show us. You tell us what to do and we'll follow your lead. I don't know. What else might he have been hoping for? You can think on that a little. So then back to verse 8. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish." Okay, so Philip is saying, there's no way for us to feed these people. We can't buy enough food. And Andrew, seeming to have have an understanding that this is an act of faith, says, there's a boy and he has some food. 5 barley loaves. Barley loaves are considered to be the poor man's bread. And then 2 fish. It was large. It was probably sardine sized, and commentary suggests that it was probably pickled. Basically, this boy brought himself a picnic lunch and then ended up with this crowd. And so you've got this faith element that Andrew's like, well, we have some food and maybe Jesus can do something with this. But then he follows it up with, but what are they among so many people? So you have a little bit of this faith and doubt coming from Andrew, or faith and realism of like, I believe that you're capable, or this person is willing to contribute, and yet at the same time, but it's really not realistic to think that, Jesus. And so we've got this boy, right? And of all of these people who are gathered, somehow this boy's food is the one that's brought to the front. And so you can imagine this little guy sitting on the outskirts of Jesus's little disciple group and hearing that there was a need, and him being like, well, I've got food. And I love that image of this child hearing this massive need, and seeing that his resources can be something to help within it. Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in this place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. I think it's amazing that of this 5,000 people sitting in this grassy area, Jesus asked the disciples to have them sit, and that it makes it sound like that's just an easy thing. Like maybe there was a hand motion, The acoustics are reported to be good in that area, where you could actually, like, Jesus could have been able to talk to them. That's how the Sermon on the Mount would have taken place. But I'm just imagining the wave of people and like trying to get everybody to be quiet. All of that would be such a logistical nightmare. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. So in the other accounts from the other Gospels, we have that Jesus breaks and blesses and then gives it to the disciples to then give to the people. In this, the disciples' activity is just getting people to sit down and be quiet, and then Jesus takes over from there. He takes what he has, he gives what the boy presented, he gives thanks for it. It probably would have been a pretty typical Jewish blessing of the time. And then Jesus distributes it to those who have been seated. And so that gives a little bit of freedom there. I mean, maybe Jesus is literally taking it to each person, like we do with communion, and saying, here. But it could also be that he's giving it to somebody to give to somebody. He distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And so they're eating. It says when they were satisfied. That word that's translated here to satisfied literally means filled or fed to repletion, which means filled beyond, like, to fullness. And so they had enough food. Now, that's where we get into some of the theological conversations of what does this mean? Is this a physical fullness, like they literally ate enough food that their bellies were full? Is it a spiritual fullness that the little bit that they were able to have filled their spirits and that made their bellies full? But regardless, it says he told his disciples, gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost. In both this situation and when it says that he asked them to have the people sit down, the way that the word is conjugated implies a please. So please gather up. So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. So now there is more bread than what they started with, and everybody has been filled to fullness. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, this is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. And so you see, like, people have awe. Commentaries say that there are a few ways to wonder about, because we don't get the details of how this miracle actually happens. We don't get to the logistics of how we go from 5 barley loaves to an abundance of bread and fish. And so there are 3 kind of primary ways in which commentaries suggest that this happens. And one is just straight up miracle, that Jesus is God is able to do whatever God wants. And so as Jesus is physically handing out the bread and the fish to people, it is multiplying, right? That more is just being created and replenished as we go. Is that possible? Sure, it's possible. I believe Jesus is the incarnate God, and that God can do whatever God wants. And we see miracles like turning water into wine and all of these different things. Like, this isn't outside of the realm of what Jesus could do or has done in other situations. So that's one option. Option number 2 is that, again, that there is this kind of spiritual fullness. So just interacting with Jesus and getting any sort of taste of anything would be filling their spirits. And so it's not so much that they're being fed on the bread and the fish, it's they're being fed by being served by Jesus. Now, if we're implying any sort of taste of bread, any sort of taste of food, 5 barley loaves and 2 fish are not enough for everybody to even get a crumb when you're talking about 5,000 people gathered. And so it really is this spiritual interaction with Jesus that's being implied. And then the final one is that the real miracle here is how the boy was willing to share his resources, and Jesus saying that his action of being willing to share is enough, that faith will be enough to cover everybody. And so as the boy shares, everybody who is gathered, who had likely brought supplies to cover themselves on their pilgrimage to Jerusalem, decides that they too will share what they have, so that as the bread is being distributed, people are also pulling more loaves out of their traveling packs. And so the real miracle is how Jesus is able to get people to contribute. And I love that notion. I love that this boy, and especially as we think about neighboring, that there is this ripple effect of the boy contributing what he has, and that inspiring more and more people to do it. And so how are we inspired by the youngest in our midst? How are we inspired by the giving and the service of others to follow suit? Yeah. And so I think anywhere you fall on that, whether that's whether you lean towards interpreting this story as Jesus doing a physical miracle, as Jesus doing a spiritual miracle, or Jesus doing a miracle in the lives and intentions of the people who are gathered as they're moved to compassion and sharing. A takeaway we can have with that, with neighboring, is that it's sparked by this little boy bringing forward his resources. That his act of generosity is what Jesus uses to create this miracle. And whatever interpretation you go from, that's a beautiful takeaway. So I hope that you guys can let that sit with you for a little bit and think about how the kids in our lives inspire us to be better, how we're inspired by their actions and their faith and their commitment and their creativity to model similar characteristics in the world, and how we too can be kind of the first ripple of impact for others to follow suit and want to make a difference. So thanks all. See you soon. Bye-bye.